Hi, my name is Yahav, and I was born and raised as an Israeli and as a Zionist. During the past few years, I've gone through the process of questioning the narrative I grew up with regarding this land we live in and the people living on it. This podcast is about voices of the disillusioned. Each episode is a one-on-one, heartfelt conversation with an activist who supports the Palestinian struggle, telling the story of the journey that led them to see through what they were taught. Each of these people has their own unique path that I believe anyone can learn from, whether you're a Palestinian or a Jew, living here or abroad, or just anyone who feels strongly about this subject. I hope you learn as much as I learned from them about how to build a better future for all people between the river and the sea. Just a quick announcement before we start. If you want to support this podcast and help me keep bringing you these stories, sign up to my Patreon, where you'll also get exclusive content and bonus episodes. Check out the link in the show notes to support this content. And thank you so much for all the supporters on Patreon who've already joined. It really means a lot to me. Idan Landau, or in Hebrew it's pronounced Landau, is a political blogger who began writing his blog Do Not Die as a Fool in 2008, where he has posted hundreds of pieces, many of them extensive investigative articles on the occupation, with emphasis on the topics of land confiscation and settlement expansion, military violence, social injustice, arms trade, Israel surveillance technology, media and propaganda, and many more. Idan has been jailed 3 times in military prison for refusing to serve in the reserve service of the IDF. He is also a professor of linguistics at Tel Aviv University and lives with his family in Tel Aviv. Hi, Idan.
Hi, Yahav.
Welcome to my podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. I introduced you at the end, like today you're a professor and you're a blogger. What did your childhood look like? What is your background? Where did your family come from?
So it's a pretty standard, I think, middle-class story of Israeli Ashkenazi Jews. Was brought up in Ramat Gan, middle-class, family, me and my 2 sisters in the 70s. And I can say that I was preoccupied with issues of social justice also in high school, I think. I began to think about those things. But it wasn't a central theme in my life. So, I was a standard teenager, very kind of literary, brainy kind of person, reading a lot. Music was very, very important to me. Literature, that kind of stuff. But politics actually became much more important by the end of the military service and then later in my 20s.
I'm assuming this is a secular family, not a religious background.
Very secular. Both parents came from, the Mapai circles.
Just a quick note, Mapai is like the Labor Party in Israel and was in control for the first basically 30 years of this country.
Yeah. So, labor, but really centrist. And, my father in particular was very anti-religious to the extent that he did not want to attend my bar mitzvah and Bet Knesset.
So who organized it?
My mom. And I did this Aliyah Torah. Actually, in hindsight, I shouldn't have because it meant nothing to me, but everybody did it back then, so I did it. But he wasn't there. I think by high school, both my parents and my mom sort of shifted towards Ratz, which is more kind of human rights, less socialist. But that was the background. Yeah.
When you were around 15, your parents started taking you to protests.
Right. So that was around the first Lebanon War, and there were many protests throughout the country, mostly in Gush Dan. So I remember going, and I remember I remember Begin's name being mentioned all the time as the bad person, the culprit.
In 1977, after almost 30 years of control of the Labor Party, the Ashkenazi hegemonic, David Ben-Gurion leadership was replaced by Menachem Begin, who was the representative of like the more working class Mizrahi background public. And this was like very historic.
I also remember the demonstrations from the other side, was Begin supporters. So it was a very tense moment in Israel history when the two camps, which were not just political but also ethnic, Ashkenazi and Mizrahim, clashed. But I remember my parents, for the first time, sort of not being shy to speak against the army or the institution, not in a very radical way, but in a way that sort of made it clear to me that wars are not sacred. That was the first time I actually understood that many people around me were disagreeing with the goals and how the goals of the war and how it was conducted. Yeah, and Ariel Sharon especially was the evil man back then. Yeah,
this is the 80s, early 80s.
Yeah, the beginning of the 80s. Yeah, 82, 81.
Mm-hmm. And you also read a lot when you were a teenager, which also influenced your like political vision.
Right. So my reading was not theoretical. It was mostly through literature and works of fiction. So, if we were trying to trace my political thinking, it started with satirical pieces mostly. So Catch-22, I think, and other also movies, Slaughterhouse-Five, Vonnegut. Those were my idols. So, I was reading satirical pieces written by people who experienced the horrors of war in Europe. By the way, there is no analog in Hebrew literature of that. So many people experienced the horrors of war, but nothing like that came in the literary scenes, which is kind of interesting. So very, very few anti-war novels in Hebrew. There are very few. Hanoch Levin in Israel actually was kind of outstanding in that. And so I think already at that age, I had this instinctive opposition to power and to what power tells us, and especially how easily governments can send young people to the battlefield for some obscure goals. So I had that notion in my head, not to take for granted that the sacrifice that we're asked to give to the state is justified, but to doubt it. I had that idea in my head already, without knowing much about concrete politics in Israel, and certainly not much about Palestinians. And yeah.
And you still chose to enlist in the army.
Now we say chose, but back then, nobody thought about it as a choice. It's like default. This is what you do. Everybody does that. The choice is within the military service. Do you go to this role or that role? But conscientious objection was not something that I was even aware of, which is pretty much the same for many people today now. It's not something that is in the range of options that they know about. So there's no role model for them. And you talk to many refuseniks, and this is what they tell you. Had we known back then that this is an option, that there is a community, that it's possible, and then we would have thought. So this is not it's just a description of what the things are like for Israeli 18 years old when they face the military service. For many of them, it's not a conceivable option for them not to go to the army. So I did go, and I even wanted to be an officer, because I wanted to sort of do something a little bit more responsible than just a plain soldier that gets orders. But I knew that I will not serve more than the extra 1 year that you have to do as an officer. So it was a 4-year service in the communication unit, where I had to sort of, mildly operate my brain to run all sorts of communication systems for the army. And I did that without thinking much about the political implications, but that came I think at the last year of my service, and certainly at the very first years of the reserve service, I became politically aware. So during the military service, I think this is, if you're not in touch with Palestinians, and I wasn't, my unit was not in touch with them, it's very easy not to think about what the army is doing in Israel and what the grand purpose is, because Like, for example, in my unit, we were preparing for big wars with armies and so on. So, sounds legitimate. We weren't even in anything that involved offensive plans. We're just on the defense. We're just planning how to defend ourselves. So you didn't think about any dark sides of the military service. So that came later.
It went together with the IDF, Israeli Defense Force. You really felt like you were part of a defense force.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's interesting that you were reading about war when you were a teenager, and you understood the anti-war sentiment, like the universal anti-war sentiment.
Right.
And then you enlisted in an army that you felt like it was preparing for a war that you were ready to participate in if needed. And it's like perceived as, no, this is something else. It's not like the Vietnam War. It's not like that war. It's
because
different.
Back then I didn't even realize that the history of Israel, in terms of who initiated which war and what other options were on the table, I was not aware of that. That many of the wars were avoidable, and well, I knew. Talked about the First Lebanon War. I knew about that war. But that war always seemed like an exception, and everything else seemed like, we were on defense. Even that is not correct today. We know about the Yom Kippur War. There were other options. We know about the Six-Day War. So, you have to read a lot of revisionist history, which is completely outside of the curriculum of normal Israelis. So this is where, reading and teaching yourself comes in. And it's very important, but that's not something that you can do at 18-year-olds without guidance. So yeah, you assume that they know what they're doing. The army is put to good service. But then there was the issue of the occupation. So the occupation is not a war; it's a state that we live in, and how is the army engaged in that? And is it really true that it's kind of a side job that we're doing, or is it the main job? So I think the big shift for me was the realization that the army, in practice, is more and more oriented towards maintaining the occupation, and not defending against some imaginary army that would invade us from Iraq so that's what we're practically doing. Certainly today, but back it already started then, because we're talking about the first Intifada. So my military service was 1989. So right when I was released, people were starting to be called to reserve service in the territories, even if they didn't even do this before in their actually compulsory service. So I was exposed more to that, and this is when after a few years, I decided that no more.
Where were you exposed? Like, did you read in the newspaper that this Intifada was going on, and you saw what was going on, and you were like, I don't want to take part in that?
Yeah. So you realize that people around you, especially those in battle units, of course, are being called to do their service there, and what they're really doing is, like policing or, oppressing demonstrations or... this was a time when Rabin actually instructed the army to break the arms and legs, you remember? So it was of the demonstrators. This was kind of, shocking. And since I was not in a battle unit, so I was a communication officer, I was not even expected to be in that role of, directly facing demonstrators with a weapon. But I was like in the background. So we were called... My first encounter was in the reserve service when I was called for 21 days or so. I was called to the Takumia checkpoint, which is an entrance point for Palestinian workers from the Hebron area to the southern part of Israel. And my role there, me and two other officers, was to be some sort of a go-between the actual entrance point and some offices that were hidden in this area where Shabak people were sitting. Okay, and
these like caravans on the side.
Caravans on the side, right in the back. So most of the workers would just go through the checkpoint. They would have their IDs checked, and they were just being cleared and get inside. And we were asked to sort of stand there and watch those that come in. And if we think that somebody might fit what the Shabak needs, just, call upon them and say, can you please come with me? And then they would come to the caravan at the back, wait for a few minutes and then be called inside and then be interviewed or whatever it was. We were never present. We were just the go-between, right?
Like there was this buffer of you standing there after they already are cleared and can go
Yes,
to work,
yes.
but you kind of cherry pick
We could pick
a
them
few.
up. Yeah.
What were you told to choose,
So
to look for?
we were instructed, we were actually working for the Shabak there. So the Shabak interrogators were looking for collaborators to recruit them, new collaborators. So we were the source of the manpower. So we were instructed to look for young people who look educated, not very miserable. Just bring them to an interview. And this was kind of, you saw how the occupation works on the ground. So we were not allowed in, of course, but we could hear sometimes voices rising from the inside. Occasionally, we would hear the interrogator yelling, and then we would see the person, the Palestinian person, kind of going out of this session that could have been just 5 or 10 minutes, sometimes quite shaken. So you see that they've been through some kind of a emotional pressure. Later I read about what's going on in those interviews. So it is extortion. They're really coercing them into collaboration by using all kinds of
Like
blackmailing, personal information, which could be related to anything that those people wants done or wants not to be known. Want not to be known. So that person, for example, might have a medical condition, or his father has a medical condition, and like cancer, and they can only be treated inside Israel. But in order to be let in Israel, they need a permit. So the permit system is a very powerful system of blackmailing, and it's been one of the main tools that Shabak is using in order to recruit collaborators. We'll let you in. We'll let your relatives in if you just give us information that we need. Many people refuse. Many people cannot really refuse. And then there was this blackmailing that's based on sexual orientation. So people who are homosexual that don't want that to be disclosed, because in Palestinian society this is a very serious issue. So they're using all that, and so sometimes we would hear that the conversation would go very smoothly, and sometimes we would hear that it would go very badly. And I also remember conversations myself with the Shabak people there that were kind of shocking to me, how manipulative they are. You would see that you're talking to a person that is really well trained in getting what they want out of people, even if you would just talk to a normal person that not as part of their job. Really very manipulative people. So by the end of those 21 days, I sort of understood that I don't want to be part of that system at all, in any function. Not in the territories, not at the border, not at the checkpoint, not even in the background, allowing this to go on while I'm looking aside. So that was a turning point, and I don't really remember at what age it was. It was the first time I was actually called for a reserve service, which was not in my unit. It was just, to operate for Shabak. And then I said, from that point on, I said, whenever I was called, I refused. So this is the 90s. We're talking about the 90s. So I was called to reserve service, and I did a few times in the reserve service without having anything to do with the Palestinians, which I'm not proud of because it was still going on. But I didn't have to face it. And then the first time I had to face it, I realized that I can't really do this anymore. And by then, my political understanding was sort of made it very easy for me to come to that conclusion. So there was no clash. It was like, that's the right thing, right? All those abstract notions of justice and equality, and I know more about the Israeli wars, and I know more about what's going on in Turkey. So all of that knowledge that I acquired, and now I'm asked, and this is the actual practice that is going on there. So I have to sort of combine them, and this is, it's no dramatic moment. If you talk to people from Shavrim Shtika, their experiences were much more dramatic, right? They actually
breaking the silence. You mean?
Yeah, the turning points, the actual experience that made them realize, oh, these are really human beings. They sort of burst into a house in the middle of the night. They see those little children crying. They're wetting their clothes. They see the horror in front of them, and that's the turning point for them. But of course, you have to remember that for them, being in those units that actually do those things, the indoctrination is much more severe. So in order to counter that, you need something more severe. So you need to be shaken psychologically out of this routine that you're part of in order to see the humans at the other side. And for me, the whole process was easier. Okay, so I didn't have to go through any trauma. I didn't have to face actual Palestinian suffering. But the little that I saw, the glimpse that I saw, and the shouts that I heard from the room, there was no physical violence. It was only verbal abuse. I could hear verbal abuse. I could hear people, the interrogator swearing, but it was all part of the extortion. It was all an act. And I came close to that dark system that I said I can no longer do it, and that's exactly what my entire understanding up to that point should have led me to conclude.
Something that had to happen.
Yeah, it had to happen. Yeah.
I think it really moves me what you said about telling you guys, the soldiers in that buffer zone, to look for the more well-educated looking young Palestinian men who maybe seem like they have more of a chance at life, and that they're not someone who has nothing to lose, right? There's something that has something to lose, and because of that, we can use that thing that they have to lose. And I remember meeting Palestinians from the West Bank initially, and they were people that were like more, I guess you could say, like me, like more into like alternative scene, more educated, more worldly, and thinking to myself, wow, like they're just like me. Like these people are really cool. Like they like the music that I like, and they introduce me to other things that I don't know about, like on their side. And wow, like there's this whole scene over there that's happening like a few kilometers away, and I don't even know about it. And I started understanding that, why should these people not have the opportunities that I have? I mean, they're kind of just like me. They have the same aspirations. They have the same mindset. They're what people call like-minded, right?
Yeah.
And then later on, it led me to the understanding that no, actually, it's not only these like cool hipster people that deserve rights and that deserve, it sounds like in hindsight, I think like, wow, you were so stupid, I tell myself. But actually, it's like this process of thinking of like, actually, through the people that I felt were more like me, then I realized that actually all the people, it doesn't even matter who they are and what they're like, they all deserve rights.
All the paths are legitimate, but it's a very natural path to follow, to first connect to people who are more similar to you, and then to realize, they have families. And
all their families are actually maybe less like me, but they also deserve, exactly. It is through their families actually that I first realized this. And what really shakes me is that these people, Israelis would always tell me, your friends, they're not, they're not the representative. They're not like the average Palestinian. They're different. Like you can connect to them and you can see their humanity because they're different. The rest are all, terrorists. And these are, you just found the few that aren't, that are more educated, that are more worldly. And why is this so disgusting? Because it's actually those people that you're talking about that were targeted and that were, saw the opportunity to take away something from them, and not the people that were elevated and seen as maybe future leaders, right?
I think also another reason that I speculated on back then was that it's very important that a collaborator would not be suspected by their immediate surroundings that they are collaborating. And maybe there's a naive thought that only people, I guess some Palestinians might think that only people amongst us that are so poor and so miserable that have nothing to lose would actually go and collaborate. People that have, because that's the worst thing you could do, betray your people. So why would anyone do that unless they're at the very bottom? And the Shabak people sort of understood, maybe we shouldn't go for those people that are at the very bottom, and then they would be less suspicious. That's also might be another reason.
There's even something more destructive in that, beyond like the personal level of those people's lives and those people's families' lives, is that Israelis tend to say, well, where is the Palestinian leadership, the people that we can actually have some kind of negotiation with, people that we can actually, people that are more educated, more, like-minded, more open-minded. Mm-hmm. And then you see what, there are those people, but how they're treated is that instead of kind of cultivating a relationship with those people that, quote unquote, the people that you can talk to that are more moderate, what they were doing was actually the opposite. They're destroying those people, destroying all chances of cultivating some kind of class of leadership, and then having a whole Palestinian people without any leadership because the people on the top are being repressed as well.
I think it's also one reason probably why universities and schools are a constant target of harassment by the Israeli occupation. So many students being arrested for social media posts, and Birzeit being invaded, other Al-Quds being invaded, and of course Hamas is present there. Hamas is a popular movement, but the reasons are very, very far removed from
actual support.
terrorist activity. Yeah, those are people, opinionated people. They talk for their people. They talk for the prisoners. Usually, it's around the prisoners.
Yeah, and they're usually very intellectual, highly intellectual.
Yeah, and that's not something that, of course, the occupier would want. I should also say that the occupier doesn't want that their own people, namely us Israelis, would be too educated.
Yeah.
So it goes both ways. Educated people are a danger. Critical thinking is not something that any government, would encourage. So critical thinking also in Israeli schools is, going down. You look at the programs, you look at what they teach, what they don't teach. That's not something that they value. And of course, they can't really use the methods that they're using in the territories to oppress independent thinking, but they could set up the system in a way that would not encourage it. And I think that's exactly what we see in history lessons, in
civics.
Civic.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's true. It's like the methods are different, but the repression of critical thinking has the same goal.
And then by the time they get to be 18, you see those horrible, TikTok clips from Israeli soldiers, gleeing and joyfully about with the ruins of Gaza behind them, because this is how they were educated. Extreme nationalism, and so that's a different thing. But I've written a lot about the Israeli education system, and I'm really worried about it. And I have two children, one of them already out of that system, the other one is, and I'm really very conscious of what's going on there. It's not good at all.
So at this point, you were in your early 20s. You had already done reserve service as an officer.
Mm-hmm.
And you were starting to realize this is what's going on. And eventually you reached the conclusion, I don't want to be part of this.
Mm-hmm.
So now what do you do the next time that you're summoned?
Yeah, so a number of times I refuse, and usually they treat officers more kindly and they let them off the hook if they can. So that really depends on the commander of the unit at that time. They keep changing every few years. But I should say one more thing about why I found it okay to go to Miluim for a few years. We had a very nice group of people there that we really liked each other, and there is this social bonding among men usually, but now also women do Miluim,
which reserves.
Which is really reserve. Yeah, I should say reserve, which is really completely on a different level from ideology, and people could be very left leaning, but the reserve for them is this escape where they can rejoin with older friends and return to more beautiful times in their own past. So there's something nostalgic at the very core of being called to reserve. You're recreating a bonding that you may have lost in your current career or something, and this is something that is very appealing. And I sensed it at the very beginning of so. For a few years, between 20 and 25, I was doing this every year. And we had lots of jokes and, people that I really enjoyed being with. So I remember being conscious of the fact that I'm now cutting ties with all those people for the rest of my life, probably because I'm going to refuse. And again, this was felt by me on a kind of mild level, but I think about all the combat units, people from Golani, Givati that have to go through this. They've been through life-threatening situations with those friends. These are their kind of the closest friends, and for some of them, refusing to serve in the army really is a social.
They're serving the reserves.
In the reserve army, it's a social, because if you refuse to enlist to begin with, then you don't have any friends yet there. But those that were kind of those friends that you acquired during the service, and very often your best friends, and the refusal really means cutting ties with many of them.
It's also kind of like, especially if it's combat, it's kind of this guilt. I
Yeah.
will let my friends go to the battlefield and
Yeah.
endanger themselves, and I will stay in the comfort of my house in
This
wherever.
actually has been even tested scientifically by psychologists that study the psychology of war and patriotism and dedication to the unit. And it comes up again and again that the main motivation, they're trying to break apart the motivations of soldiers. Why do they go to risk their lives? It's kind of a counterintuitive thing. Why do they do this? Is it patriotism? Is it that they're identified with the goals of the war? But it's always throughout every army and everywhere. It's always number one motivation is loyalty to the unit, to the smallest unit, to your friends, not wanting to leave them by their own. And this loyalty, you even see this with people that are actually wounded on the battlefield in the hospital. They want to return as soon as possible. They don't even want their treatment to end. They feel guilty. Okay, we cannot really leave our friends behind there while we're here. So people were always wondering, why not from the outside? Why not? Why don't we see more Israelis refusing? Because on one level, many Israelis do feel that it's very, very bad, the occupation. But at the psychological level, this bonding is so strong in Israeli society that it's really hard to break. And I think the only way to overcome this is to create equally rewarding bonds for those who do refuse. So not to let them to be left in the void without friends, without anyone that understands their decision, because they are going to lose, friends. But there are also friends that they can acquire this way, Israelis and Palestinians that share their views, share their thinking. And for many Israelis, especially the younger ones that refuse at an early stage, it's a turning point in their life. So it really means the beginning of, some sort of activist life. They would form new connections with people in activist groups and so on. And that could also be very rewarding. So I don't think Israelis should be sort of confined to find their closest friends just
through the military
on
service.
the back of Palestinians, right? There must be other ways to
form bonding,
without
meaningful relationships.
That would not necessitate, the oppression of other people.
Yeah, definitely. And you discovered all this when you were in your first imprisonment, when you decided, I'm going to refuse now. You were 24 years old?
I was there with a bunch of nice people that also refused. That was the second Intifada, 2001. So a bunch of us were in the same room and we shared, our views and everything. So that was a nice experience. But of course, I was prepared already to that. So it wasn't like, I didn't know that they're going to be there beforehand. So, but they became kind of friends. And
so walk me through it. You decide, you get called for reserves.
Mm-hmm.
During the second Intifada, for the first time, you are like, I'm not going to do this. I am willing to go to prison. Yeah. What happens next?
So the commander of the unit puts you on trial, and you get 2 weeks on jail, and they just take you, and you're taken to Atlit, the prison 6 near Atlit, where they put both. So it's where they keep both the reserve soldiers and the officers. I was both an officer and on reserve, but even if you're just an officer in your regular service, you would be there. And that's the better prison, because Kele Arba, which is, I think, in Tzrifin, is worse. So you get a better treatment, but it's still prison, very small cells, very strict routine. So they wake you up at 5:30 or 6. They count you 2, 3, 4 times a day, and there's no activity at all. So you're really bored. You have to come with some sort of find some way to occupy yourself, and you're hungry. There's not enough food, I remember, but other than that, it's not a terrible. There is no abuse.
Because you're an officer, so they treat you better than the regular soldiers in prison.
There is no abuse, no verbal abuse, and no other. It's just like a shitty place to be. You sleep on uncomfortable bed. You're hungry, but it's just for 2 weeks. So yeah. It's a worth price to pay, I think.
And you met other officers that refused to be in reserve duty when you were there.
Yeah.
But you formed, like you were talking about, this kind of alternative bond that you could form. Was that something that you found there?
Yeah, and for me, it was more interesting to actually talk to people who were in jail, not for those reasons.
Like not for refusing, but for
other reasons.
Something that they did during their service.
It's called defection, where they don't show up when they're called, and they just if you don't show up for service for whatever reason, then you would put in jail.
Mm-hmm.
So personal problems, issues, just they simply didn't fit, and it was interesting for me to talk to them because they were much, and this is something that comes up again and again in testimonies of refuseniks that came back from jail. People in jail are much less judgmental than people outside jail about our decision. So they hear what we have to say.
So these are people who are in jail for different reasons, not for refusing. And then you start having this conversation with them.
And they totally understand. Well, they might disagree, but they're not judgmental.
Because they are also suffering from the system.
They're also been stigmatized. They also didn't fit. They can perfectly understand outsiders that don't fit for different reasons. And the prison is the great equalizer. So we're all equal in some sense. And personally, I also think that most of those people should not really be in jail. They're not felons. They didn't commit crimes. They just didn't fit the system. The army insists on enlisting people that don't fit. So it was more interesting to talk to them than to actually people that sort of agree with me on everything. Yeah.
So what you're saying is like the first imprisonment was like a formative experience where you kind of sharpened your political views even more?
That wasn't, no, I have to say, as I said, my political views were already sharp enough before that. That was, I should have gone to jail earlier. This is what I think, because my consciousness was already there. It's just that my practice was lagging. So if my practice was synchronized with my thinking, then it would have happened earlier. So there was no ideological sort of shock to me there or rethinking. I was already well-baked.
And did you get any backlash from people outside, like your family, your friends, people from the unit?
Well, the first time was even reported in the Haaretz.
In the newspaper.
Yeah. And yeah, I got some backlash from, I guess, students or people that didn't like that, but also I got a lot of support. So there was some visibility to that. I was the 13th refusnik in the, they still counted them in the second intifada. So at the very beginning, they actually reported every one of them. So I was at the stage that they reported every one. I don't know how many altogether there were, but there was a small piece, maybe also because I was in university. And there were letters sent from my colleagues abroad, also on the second or third time. And now they got all mixed up.
Who are your colleagues abroad? Like from academia?
Linguists. Yeah, linguists from the linguistics community. Yeah.
That supported you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you were not, this was not like dramatic for you, this whole situation.
No,
your
it was not.
Your name being on the newspaper and coming out of prison. It was just like you were ready for all of this?
Yes.
How did you know what was going to happen? Did you have some kind of support from some kind of organization, or?
You talk to Yesh Gvul, they have experience. They tell you what to expect.
Who are Yesh Gvul? Explain to people who don't know.
That's the Israeli human rights groups that was formed during the First Lebanon War from those people who refused there, and it kept on going with advice and support for soldiers that decide not to go to the army.
So there was kind of a network that did give some kind of support for whoever needed it.
Yeah, I was in touch with them, but honestly, emotionally, I didn't need that much because I knew that I was doing the right thing already.
It's so different to be like 24, 25 years old and already a student with some kind of self-worth. I'm in the linguist community than like when you're 17, 18 and you have to just like, okay, this is going to be my adult life from now, and now I have to like handle all of this.
Yeah, it's very different. Those young people, 18-year-olds, I admire them because they even, of course, they pay a higher. I mean, they sit for 4 or 5 months usually, and that completely changes their lives. But also their lives are not there yet. So it's actually it's a much. They influence their lives in a much more meaningful way than I did. For me, it was more revolutionary. But everyone follows their path. It's okay.
In what way was it revolutionary?
Evolutionary, I meant. And so
Oh.
for me, it was more gradual because it started with reading, with looking at people around me, with much more gradual.
And then you were also jailed 2 other times.
2 other times. So first time was 2 weeks, second time was 2 weeks. The last time was 1 week. The last time was when I was 44.
Wow.
1 year before my official release from reserve service. I was the oldest prisoner in jail, I think. And it was right during Pesach. So I actually asked for a favor from the commander not to jail me in Pesach so that I would be able to be with my family. And they
For
agreed.
the holiday.
Yeah. But that was kind of absurd. And I was also only me and one other person there in jail. So 1 week by myself with my books. And that time, I think, was also, yes, that was the time when the university, I sort of clashed with my university. That was Ben Gurion University, before my current position, which is in Tel Aviv. I clashed with the university that decided to punish me by deducting my salary. So a quarter of my salary.
Because why would they deduct your salary? Because you
it all
sat
started
in
with
prison.
Im Tirtzu. Im Tirtzu, should I explain what that is?
Yeah.
You should explain what that is.
Im Tirtzu is basically a right-wing movement organization that is very much supportive of the military and what the military does. And they're very active in universities. They have like a branch in each university. Actually, I remember them when I was a student as well. Basically they
Persecuting
try
and
to,
snitching. Yeah, that's what they're doing best.
yeah,
They're
like persecuting the more like left-leaning students and professors
faculty.
as well.
Yeah, there was a time that they would actually record classes and then would shame on social media people that had said things that, God forbid, standing for Palestinian rights. So they were also very keen on sending letters. So when I was jailed, I think they sent a letter to the president. So this is how this completely minor incident that I was missing a week from work came to be known by the university authorities. So this is when they decided, and I think that was unprecedented. People got jailed before from the faculty. I'm not the only leftist there. That was the first time that they punished somebody on their salary. Yeah.
Oh, so it started with Im Tirtzu. It's interesting because when I Googled your name in Hebrew, I think one of the first results were this kind of database of, it's called the Hakeret HaMartze. It's this database of Im Tirtzu where they say, these are the, traitor faculty from the universities. And then they have like a little blurb about each of you.
It's pathetic. It's pathetic. They know nothing about my real activity. They sort of pick your names from petitions, from stuff like that. You could see that they haven't even actually read anything from my blog because things I say there are much more serious than, what they would just pick up from news. It's pathetic. Their research department is really very pathetic.
As a researcher, you're very interesting. But still it feels like ostracizing, like to see your name on like this blacklist. Or are you proud of it? Like, what do you feel when you see this kind of stuff?
Because they're so pathetic, I'm not even proud of it, So they don't deserve our attention. That's what I think. The more attention we give them, the more we make of them, which they don't really deserve. So we could just go on. Yeah. Ignore them.
So the university did actually comply and decide to, cut your salary down. What was that about?
I felt really bad about it. And then I announced, that was many years ago. That was 2011. And then I announced officially, this is not my home. So I'll do my best to actually find a different place. It wasn't easy in Israel. It's a small world, but that was the root of my reasons to want to move to a different department. And I did it last year this year actually, to Tel Aviv University. But I have to say that the reaction within the university was kind of mixed. There were people behind me. The union was behind me up to the point when it actually meant, really standing up against the management, and then they backed up. So they didn't really do anything about the deduction. So you could see how fascism works. Intimidation, labeling, shaming, and, people constantly having to prove their patriotism, constantly having to prove that they're loyal to some, national goal, or people just wanting not to be part of that in my actual department. So that was kind of a nice laboratory experiment to see how people behave in situations that are not really terrible for them, but they would not do what they can in order to stop those processes. So those processes are going on all the time. Their main victims are Palestinian students, Arab students in Israeli universities, especially in times of wars like that, when they're being constantly watched and persecuted, and complaints about them. It's not just Im Tirtzu, just their fellow students are doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It used to be, I think, more of an initiative of like these branches of, student organizations, but now it's just, the average Israeli student in a class with a Palestinian student seeing an Instagram story with a Palestinian flag and being like, he's a Hamas supporter.
So they're all kind of soldiers. All those Zionists are really soldiers on leave all the time, with or without uniforms, and they're always on the guard. Is there somebody around me that is, identifying with Palestinians, and then they should be reported.
And what's really ironic is that now recently, throughout this war that we're experiencing right now, Israeli students have been like telling on Palestinian students for, kind of social media content, sympathizing with Gaza or anything like that. And then a friend of mine who's actually a student in Tel Aviv University was telling me that the opposite also happened. So a bunch of Palestinian students went to the management and said, look, there's a Israeli student publishing like incitement, like real incitement, like death to all Arabs and stuff like that on social media during the war. And the university, while using these like disciplinary measures for the Palestinian students, when confronted with an actual like real incitement from an Israeli student, they told them, go to the police. We're not going to handle this. This is actually criminal. Go to the police, which is so ironic because it tells you the whole story about if it was that dangerous and really criminal when it comes to the Palestinians, would they also say go to the police? Like it's so telling about this situation and how imbalanced it is.
Right. Yes. I totally agree. It's very depressing. So there's something also heightened consciousness of how we are perceived, and are we perceived patriotic enough? So on every level, students, the management, are we perceived as patriotic enough? Are we not, by any chance, perceived as sympathizing with Palestinians? And sympathizing with Palestinians doesn't mean sympathizing with terrorists. It's just like it's been.
That's what it's become.
It's become like that, yeah. But just of course, if you're a Palestinian, you're going to sympathize with your people, just like we feel very upset if there's some anti-Semitic incident, in Belgium. That's something that we cannot really understand, Israelis. So there's a lot of. Maybe this is also part of social media atmosphere, but people have to showcase their patriotism. They have to sort of actively engage in acts that show how patriotic they are.
So what you're saying is,
it's not enough just to say it, but you have to point to traitors.
Yeah, so that what you're saying is people don't necessarily feel like they're threatened by, a post with a Palestinian flag, or they don't necessarily feel that it's that wrong that person has to like lose their job or be expelled from university, but they know that it's on them to prove how patriotic they are through snitching on someone else.
And then many of them don't even realize that this can actually end up in that person being dismissed or being fired. It's happening.
They just want to shame them, and then
and the shaming culture, and we know where it came from. So shaming culture, so combined with patriotism, it's horrible.
Wow.
I can also say another thing that I think I omitted. One of the donors of the university from the UK was very upset about that. And that donor actually, I know them through academic circles. So they threatened the university with stopping their donation because the university did that to me.
Oh.
Yeah. But unfortunately, that wasn't a very big donation. So the donation went to, I think, students for fellowships for students, not for high tech, not for buildings and so on. So I think the Rivka Karmi, who was the president back then, she was the culprit. She was the one that actually approved it, and I also talked to her about the incident. She said, "Okay, go ahead." So it was more important to her to stand.
To show her patriotism.
Yeah, because, and I think if the donor was actually much heavier, maybe the decision would have been different. Anyway, my conversation with her at the time, I remember one thing she said to me, which was really horrible. She tried to convince me that it's not about the political thing at all. So, the story, the official story of the university was that we don't get reimbursed by the army for your time in jail as we do for any other regular service. So your salary comes from the army and they reimburse us. You missed out a week. The department collapsed. we have to compensate ourselves financially. We couldn't, so we take it from your salary and now we're good. That was bullshit, right? And in the letter that I wrote, actually, and I distributed it to the whole community of the faculty, I said, I was punished once by the army, which is fair enough. I knew that I was going to be punished. It's completely unfair that I would be punished by my employer for my political decision, which was not even connected to my work. I don't use my work as a platform to disseminate my views. So that was, this is how fascism looks like. You have to be constantly to prove that you're not a traitor. And I think by the end of the conversation we had, Rivka Karmi sort of gave up on this false excuse. And she said, look, you have to be proud of yourself that you paid a double price for your ideology. Right?
Now she's on your side. Like politically, and she's saying, oh, we gave you street cred because we made the punishment
you want to
worse.
be a martyr, right? I don't want to be a martyr. I want to make a point.
That's so weird.
Yeah.
Wow. And when did you start writing your blog? Was this after being imprisoned?
A few years. So I started in 2008. A few years before that, so in the first, 2005 or 6, I was writing pieces for Ynet.
Which is a very prominent Israeli newspaper.
About, political analysis, but they would, and that was kind of not regular. But I realized two things. First thing, I didn't like it that they're very popular, but they wouldn't pay, which I didn't like. And the second thing was that I realized that writing op-eds is not the best channel through which I can actually influence readers, and it's a genre that I should abandon soon. So I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to talk more about facts. And I realized that the platform of writing in the web, which allows you to link articles, is something that I should use more. And then I also realized that any commercial site would not allow you to put links to competitors. So if I want to publish on Ynet and link to an article in Haaretz or vice versa, that would not work. So, and I needed to do that because, when I Google and when I search, I do my research, I just need to, I would just link to the best source that I have. So I needed that freedom. So I started writing the blog. And
you do have a lot of hyperlinks in your blog posts.
That was like the main thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't at the very beginning. So the very beginning, I would write shorter pieces. We're talking about 2008, June, July, August, about all sorts of things, not just politics, but also politics, culture, music, philosophy, linguistics. And then came Cast-Led. Cast-Led operation.
First, what Israelis call operation in Gaza.
Yeah.
2008.
Yeah,
right?
and the end of 2008, so December. Yeah. So about half a year after I started my blog, and then immediately I was kind of sucked into that because I realized the gap between what I'm told by the media and what actually happens on the ground as we get reports from journalists and from human rights organizations. It's actually very different from the current conflicts that I should explain. Back then, there were many more people on the ground than they are now in Gaza, because Gaza now is a disaster zone. Nobody can actually enter there, and there are very few journalists in there. And many of them are associated in our eyes with the enemy. So Al Jazeera and Palestinian news agencies, but there are hardly any Western journalists there at all. That was not the situation in the previous cycles. And there were also NGO people, B'Tselem was there, and, Amnesty was there. They're not in Gaza now. So there were constant sources of reliable, neutral reports that were ignored and not used by Israeli media. And I started collecting all that and giving a picture that was very different from the official picture. So then I saw, and you need all the links, you need to read, you need to synthesize. So I said, I can do that. I can use my academic training. I can write in a way which is not academic about things that are really important. And I realized this is something that was missing. And back then, there were one or two more bloggers in Israel that did the same kind of job. I should mention them by name. They deserve it. So the first one was Eyal Klein. He's now in the UK, so he left Israel. And the other one was the late Yossi Gurvitz, who was writing shorter pieces, but also with the same kind of attitude. So just the three of us. And we felt that we were really doing something that is needed, something that is not there in the media. So that's how the blog started.
You were writing in Hebrew about things that Hebrew readers wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. But you weren't creating the information from scratch. No. You were kind of collecting the information from media sources, from Israeli media or from human rights organizations, but like information usually in Hebrew, right? And then kind of like putting it together and doing these compilations and then like explaining the situation in pretty accessible language. This is like such a big service if you know how Israeli media works.
I realized right away something very, very basic, which is there's a very big difference between information and knowledge. So, especially in the information age. So we're inundated, we're swamped by information. And that just reduces our understanding.
Exactly.
As opposed to the times where we were just fed by 2 or 3 channels, one major newspaper, and you could say back then this was all propaganda, but at least we had a stable kind of grip on what happens. Now people don't know what's happening. So and this has been going on for a while. So I didn't do any independent research. It was all kind of secondary research. Using most of what I used was actually Israeli sources, Israeli newspapers.
And human rights organizations.
Yeah. But much of that was newspapers. Much of what was the second to last paragraph in a piece that appeared in Ynet or in Haaretz, and nobody really paid attention to that. So I would read carefully stuff, and then I would actually say, look, if you put that together with that, you get a very different picture. So the level of filtering and framing and distortion that the media is involved with, sometimes not even consciously, but sometimes consciously, is so immense. And this is something that we really need, literacy in media, reading, understanding media. I think it should be taught in high school, literacy, media literacy, how to actually decipher news.
Yeah, but as we've said, critical thinking, which is what that leads to, is not something that we want to encourage here.
No government would initiate this kind of studies, but we need it at the very basic, not media studies in the university. I really mean,
how to read the media.
Kids that start read the news, I don't know, age 13 or 14 should already be taught how to distinguish, headline, byline, how to distinguish different sources.
What is framing?
Yeah. So framing is really important. So, and you see that, I could immediately see that this was a service that people wanted, because these were really long pieces, much longer than what you would have in the news. And still people would say, we read it, we want more of that. Okay? There were still those that complain, okay, why can't you write any shorter pieces? You want a shorter piece, go to the news. What do you want from me? I'm such a marginal voice. Why should I follow the format that is so popular? I want to try something else. So.
Yeah, but you're not marginal, actually. I think the last blog post that you wrote about the war in Gaza...
The last one was really popular, but, overall, I am marginal, I think, my opinions and my voices. So overall...
Like, how many people would read your blog posts?
Well, let's start from the beginning. The beginning was very small, hundreds. It was in the hundreds, and then it started climbing, a few thousand. The peaks, a popular post would be something around 5,000. I would say, whoa, that's really a lot of exposure. So, and then there were a few that were in the peak around 17 or 20,000. These were the records usually. For many years, I didn't even reach those numbers. And when I wrote several pieces that were, you'd sometimes put a lot of work into something, and then you would just see, 800 views, and you're like, okay. Although the numbers, I should say, we shouldn't count everything by the numbers. And the reason is that it took me a while to see that some important people read me. Some journalists and some kind of opinion decision makers. It actually took me a while to see that, because sometimes I would read in an analysis in some newspaper something that sounded exactly like what I wrote a day before.
Oh, wow.
Or 2 days before, yeah. And occasionally I would even be contacted by journalists. And then the reward is much greater, because if you see your views being represented in mainstream media, even without credit, that doesn't really matter. It's as long as you're sort of shifting the discourse to so things that I sort of insisted on for many years becoming more and more mainstream. That's nice. But yeah, you were talking about the last one. So the last one was written after a long time of silence, which I don't write a lot in the blog anymore. And that reached, I think, this is almost now in the 50,000.
Wow.
50,000.
So 50,000 Hebrew speakers.
Yeah.
Which is probably most of them Jewish Israelis read this.
Jews, I don't know if Israelis, many of them are from abroad, but lots of them, lots of them follow the blog, and many of them are new readers. I read responses from new readers, so that was nice. And this is one of the longest, if not the longest piece.
Yeah, it's like 13,000 words.
13,000 words, yeah.
I remember actually seeing a tweet on Twitter saying, I think it was like a few days after the war began, and everybody was it was chaos, and everybody was like confused and scared and angry, and just everything was horrible. And I remember someone wrote, no matter what you do, just make sure to read Idan Landau's post about this war. Just like, I think he was like, read Idan Landau, read Idan Landau. He repeated it like for 5 different times. And then I was like, oh, okay, I really have to read this. And I had known about your blog. Actually, I learned about it from following you on Twitter, which you're also very active in. But I remember actually one of my guests on the podcast mentioned you as someone who had very important influence on him, like shifting his views and understanding what was going on here. And it's the guy that does the graffiti of Why Did I Enlist? So I'm plugging in on a different episode, but right. I think that when he was like
one of my idols.
So first of all, it's mutual, just so you know. You're his idol, he's your idol. Very exciting. I like this kind of crossover. But I think that a lot of people, if they're willing to listen and to research and to want to really understand what's going on here and not what they're being told, they then have this source, which is what you provide. And it's so important. It's like, I really appreciate it.
So one goal of that is also to have it there. So it's kind of an archive of knowledge, political knowledge, that I want to be there for a long term, not just, as they say about newspapers, that you wrap fish with that the other day. So some of those pieces really have a long shelf life because they talk about a situation that has been going on for decades, and even though some of the numbers are different, the basic analysis is still the same. And coming back to numbers, it's more important for me to actually influence, a small group of people that take up that topic. And this happened several times. So I write about something, and then a group of activists uses that as a platform, use that as a starting point for some activity that they're doing. And that's the most rewarding thing of all. So if I wrote about the Jordan Valley, like 3 or 4 long pieces about what's going on there with land, with water, with the Israeli settlements, which are not even perceived as settlements because they were put there by the Labor Party. Many of them are, moshavim, kibbutzim. They're not call settlements. But the exploitation there is of the worst kind. So here again, we find this gap with, between the image or the self-image or the public image of those projects and what's actually happening on the ground. So it was important to me to actually write about it. And there was a group of activists that, followed it up and used that information. Or I wrote about, at the very beginning of Sheikh Jarrah, I guess the first political piece that I wrote was about Sheikh Jarrah.
Oh, really?
At the very beginning, in 2008. And I know that it served those people there that started working there. Or I wrote about something completely different. So I don't just write about Palestinians just to make a point. I had a long piece about the how bad the situation is in the school system of Israel, how the crowdedness. So that the fact that they have 40 plus pupils in a class, like sardines. So it was something like sardines. And so it's a very long piece, analyzing what's the history of that? Why are we so behind the European standard and so on? And that was taken up by the people that came with those data to the Knesset and argued for that cause. So and there are and the gas. I wrote about the gas. It was a long post about the gas resources.
So it's like environmental education.
Yeah. So things that involve, but the common thread is that we citizens deserve more. The government cheats, or the government hides, or the government sort of serves, narrow interests of a certain industry or a certain class or whatever it is that I'm looking at. And we deserve more. It's a democracy. At least we can voice our protests. So that was the, people with dedication and time that were actually exposed to that used that. So, this is what political writing should do. And this is what I didn't like about op-eds. Here is my opinion. Okay, we have thousands of opinions. So political knowledge should become a tool, should be something that people use to think and act, which is also a reason why I never found it I never found any reason to actually put those pieces together in a book or publish it academically, because that would sort of just remove it from the public arena. You want it to be there. You want it to be useful. You want the links to be useful.
To be accessible.
Yeah. So this is political writing. I have an academic career. I don't need to have another academic career in, occupation studies. This is not what I'm looking for. I want a guy that is like 17 or 18 to be able to read what I'm writing and to be able to put it to practice in their own lives. And that happens, and that's what it should. That's what political writing should do, I think.
You said this is a democracy, but from your writing, it sounds like you see that this is not really a democracy.
Right. It's a declared democracy. What I mean by it's a democracy, at least there are many of us that still have the privilege of saying what we think without fearing the consequences. Although, the range keeps being narrowed down and permissible opinions are being curbed. But we're talking about Jewish, white people, males, have more options. So we should use them. This is what I meant. Of course, I know that the democracy here is a very inaccurate term to what's happening in Israel, but there are very different levels of freedom in Israel. They're very, very different populations. So those of us that can speak and can influence others should do it. It's always a challenge. What's the best way to do it?
And you said that what you find most effective is for like a 17-year-old teenager to read your blog and make decisions with that knowledge. And you write a lot about conscientious objection and refusing to serve in the military and turning it into a political campaign and not just getting exempt from the army, because there's a difference. So can you kind of talk about like what is it about this price that you pay sitting in prison that is different than just kind of dodging it somehow and making some kind of excuse or getting exempt legally?
In my view, many of the ailments of Israeli society are rooted in the military service and are rooted in the central place that the military service has. So, occasionally I would say we're really like a Spartan society where militarism is so dominant. So once you break that, if you break the hold, if you sort of challenge that, lots of good things would happen, I think, on very different things, not just in terms of our attitude to Palestinians, but also in terms of, feminist goals, for example, or thinking about social justice. I don't think we can ever be a truly just society when the army, which is a source of so much, I think, economic inequality in Israel. If you just think about this, Jews versus Arabs, the army is there, and Arabs don't go to the army. That affects their life. That affects their employment possibilities. That affects so many things. There's a new bill now, if you've read, sort of expanding an older bill that exempts soldiers that got released from the army from any tuition in the university, so they don't have to pay anything for the study, which is good enough. They contributed to the country. Okay, but what about those that don't have a chance? 20% of the population,
Palestinian citizens of Israel.
They're not going to get that privilege. So the army has lots of repercussions in life. Of course, the ubiquity of weapons. People talk about that now.
Yeah.
So I think if a person comes to resist the military service at a very early stage in their life, it's going to have radical implications for their thinking about so many different topics. It's just because how we live. If I were to live in a different country where it wouldn't be the army, but it would be something else that is so dominant, I would probably fight against that. If it was some kind of an environmental thing that sort of dominates our lives, but this is where we live, so we have to focus on what really makes it so difficult for Israel to become a true democracy. So that's why much of my writing is about the army in many different ways, not just the service, but also I wrote a lot about the military industries and the military exports and how they are actually feeding into the preservation of the occupation by buying Israel diplomatic support from suspect regimes around the world and so on. So there's so many circles that are preserving this anomaly that we live in, and resisting the core, resisting the importance, resisting the centrality of, I think, the military service is a common thread that you have to face.
And it's not so much of like how powerful one person refusing to serve in the military and sitting in prison is, but more of how this affects their thinking, and then later on can make them more of an activist.
Right.
That knows, has the political thinking needed to really make a change.
Right. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. I don't view the refusal to serve the army as a goal in itself. And it was conceived as a goal, I think, 20 or 30 years ago, when people were naive enough to think that the phenomenon would be so popular so as to make the army stop and rethink, we can no longer maintain the occupation with so many refuseniks. That was a naive dream. There would never be that many refuseniks.
Like, it's not always going to be a minority.
It's always going to be a tiny minority, and many of those that actually refuse what we call the gray zone of refusal, sort of find a way not to go to the army, and the army finds a way to let them do it. Because
what's this gray zone? Let's talk about.
So people who are not ideologically explicit in saying we're against the occupation, or we're pacifists and we don't want to take part of that, but people just say I don't fit. I don't want to go to the army
for different reasons, for personal reasons,
psychological reasons. I don't fit, and the army. Sometimes, the army found that, not putting them in jail is better for their purposes, because then the phenomenon would not get coverage, would not be perceived as a clash, and the army is more humane. And of course, they should do that. But then on the other hand, the army keeps, and the image is that it's a compulsory service. It's not compulsory service. So many populations are not there, and many people sort of get away with it. And it is compulsory when it comes to the ideological refusing. So there, the army does want to make a point. We would not allow you to challenge, but this is not about, it's not because we need those people. It's not about
Yeah, it's not like
So it's really about teaching them a lesson and making the lesson known. But the army sort of realized that it's better to have this group as small as possible. So
like contain it, not like blow it up, but more bury the
yeah.
stories.
So unless the person is really outspoken, if the person would not go to the media and be interviewed, for example, if they're just doing it privately, there are good chances that the army would not put them in jail.
So this is the difference between 2001, the first time that you were refused as a reservist officer, and now, which is a different situation. The army is trying to like kind of leave that quieter. And when you were doing it, they were like reporting it, each one. They were like counting them.
Yeah.
So you think they like learned the lesson.
But even the organizations of the left that were, I think there was a time, maybe before, that they thought it's going to be a mass movement. It's never going to be a mass movement. That's my disagreement. I don't think it's going to be a mass movement. I think the importance of this act is, as you said, in its dramatic effect on the person that undergoes it, and maybe the people that would be
affected by, like around.
And
the circles of this person.
It's it's the beginning of a life of activism in a way.
So instead of seeing it as like the end game, as like I'm not going to go to the military, I'm going to sit in prison, and then I've done my part in ending the occupation. It's actually the opposite. It's just the beginning, and
in practice it is. Yeah, you cannot. There's no way back after you did that. I think when you realize when you pay the price and you realize that the state did not really listen to your arguments, and you're on your own. Then you're looking for friends, and you're looking for people that have of the same opinion, and you. It's such an important realization. I mean, Israel is very strongly, how should I say, a collectivist society. We're all together, yachad nenatzeach, right?
They're saying all the banners, the billboard signs now saying we will win together.
Yeah. So the word together is being constantly used, not even before the war. Even before the war, you just watch television, read the news. There are newspaper headlines that use it all the time. Together. So this has been ingrained in us from very early age that we're all together in this. And the other side is that, of course, because the world is against us, so we should stick together.
Yeah.
Okay? So
it works together.
The ghetto mentality.
Yeah.
So we should all stick together because otherwise
everybody's going to destroy us.
Yeah. And a big part of this together is the military. So just being able to tell yourself as a young person, I can exist. My life can be meaningful if I'm not together on every single point with this society. There's nothing natural about it. It's a matter of choice. We just don't realize it's a matter of choice. We just like flow with the stream.
Yeah.
And I can find other communities of solidarity or other people that think like me. And I don't really have to always think of myself as part of the tribe of Jews in Israel. There are other tribes. I don't say, walk away from that tribe, but there are other tribes.
So you're saying now that someone feels alone by, taking this step of refusing and then kind of crossing the line, they don't, first of all, they don't have to leave their own tribe, but they can find solidarity with other people who have either done the same thing or Palestinians who obviously can feel more comfortable to connect with that person because of their political stance.
Yeah.
And you're saying this is a source of support and also a source of togetherness that doesn't have to always come from the same source.
Right. There's another aspect of that I think we should mention, which is men versus women, because that's another kind of collective identity that is really very, very important to us from very early age. And this is also something that you need to challenge. In Israel, masculinity, the relation between masculinity and militarism. So I remember for myself, resisting that part of my identity that was militaristic was also resisting part of it that were masculine in a way. Masculine, I mean, in the sense of the cultural concept of what it means to be a man in Israel. It means to be, strong. It means to be carry arms. It means to be threatening, and it also it has lots of implications. So when you have to, I think, again, facing your role as a soldier is also facing your role as a man, or facing the role that is imposed on you as a man, and you have to start thinking, do I want to fulfill all those functions? Can I actually shape my own identity in a way that doesn't really align with those categories so easily? They're not God-given. The meaning of being a man or the meaning of masculinity sort of shifts from one time to the other, one place to the other. So I guess what I'm saying is that people should be more autonomous in how they, and feel that they have the autonomy, know that they have it in shaping their affinities or creating their connections with other communities around them, and just don't take for granted that the one community that you were told you're part of, and there's no other community. That's going to be true for the rest of your lives. So there's so much depends on that, on being able to see through. And to me, I don't know why, but I was just like born like that. I never took it for granted that this kind of identity or that kind of identity is something that I should just take for granted. I was thinking that, I always thought about identity is something that gives us power, support, times of need, but it's also confinement. And I was always concerned about the confinement part. That it doesn't. I can't really see the other people that are not part of this group right now because I'm told that they're not in my group. So this is something that connects, I think, to this whole discussion.
Thank you, Idan, for this such interesting and insightful conversation, and for everything that you do. And I want to invite anyone who's listening, if you want to hear more about what's happening right now and the current situation, like a kind of more open conversation about Gaza, to go to my Patreon, and you can hear the extra bonus episode there. And if you want to support the podcast, then you're invited to go to my Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes. You can get exclusive content there and help me keep bringing this to awareness and keep creating this content. So thank you so much for all the people that are already supporting. I really, really appreciate it. This is a really big part of, helping me do this more and more. And if you don't want to join the Patreon, but you still want to support the podcast somehow, then you're welcome to follow on whatever streaming platform you're listening to this through. Rate it 5 stars. It'll help it get to more ears and get more exposure. So thank you very much for all your support and all your feedback, and everyone just listening. Thank you, Idan.
Thank you.